This is the time of year when I'm out and about a lot, doing lots of teaching because it's autumn and so it's bulb planting time. And I can hand over lots of information about our trials of different varieties, but also about methods like how to keep grey squirrels off your bulbs, etc., etc. So there's lots coming up. Courses at Perch Hill from October the 21st to the 24th, covering all my classic courses. I'm also at Gate Street even the week before that. That's the most beautiful venue in the Surrey Hills from the 14th of October till the 16th of October. So check that out with lots of different subjects. I'm then at Oxley's Barn in Gloucestershire from the 11th to the 14th of November, so a bit nearer Christmas, and we're going to be doing quite a bit on Christmas there. And finally, I've got a week of courses at Perch Hill again, really concentrating on Christmas from the 18th to the 20th of November. So I hope you'll find something that might interest you amongst some of those. See you then. Welcome to Grow Cook Eat Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven. Today, I'm going to talk about the whole thing of bulb lasagnas, and I'm not going to bang on about the stuff that I've talked about in the past, which is it's like a lasagna. I'm going to give a quick recap, and instead of the meat, you've got compost, and instead of the bechamel sauce, you've got bulbs. So you've got your layers like a lasagna, but you've got bulb, compost, and the point is the bulb near the bottom should be the latest flowering and the largest bulb because it's got to go on the longest journey before the leaves can get into the light and photosynthesize. And the smallest and ideally first flowering bulb goes in the top and the middle in the middle, if you see what I mean. And the point about doing this is that it's very difficult to get a really, really showy bulb combination, either in a container or even in the garden without bulbs touching. So if you can actually layer them below each other and not worry if the shoot of one bangs into the bulb of another because it will just go round, then it will work brilliantly. And you can then get a much showy patch over the same surface area, but cramming a great deal more in. So that is really the point of a lasagna. So we've been doing them in our containers here for decades, and it works absolutely brilliantly. You don't get stunted bulbs. You think that the one at the bottom layer is going to come up only a few inches tall, but it doesn't. They seem to be programmed to have the right amount of stem and leaf to photosynthesize, and they will grow until they have that before they open their flower. So it is remarkable how it works. It really is. You can't plant them sort of 4 foot deep, of course, but you can certainly go down to sort of 10 to 12 inches and you will be absolutely fine. We also move from doing that in containers to doing that in the garden. And we have now really quite evolved beds here that take us through from January flowers until November or even December. And this is actually in the cutting garden, but I've started to introduce this idea of lasagnaing in the main part of the garden too, because it's just as important to have showiness and layering down. And obviously in a perennial border, it's more difficult because you've got bulbs and shrubs and, if it's mixed, you can't sort of dig out large areas, but you can still layer bulbs one on top of another by going in with a deeper bulb planter and putting, say, an allium, and then slightly to the side, putting a tulip, and then slightly to the side with a trowel, perhaps putting in a crocus or an iris or reticulata or whatever. Anyway, in the cutting garden, I'm just going to explain quickly the layering that we do to guarantee flowers from January until December. And then I am going to be a little bit sort of controversial in a way because I know not everybody has a greenhouse, but I am going to finish with a new lasagna that we have experimented with and just had such great success with in our greenhouse and talk to you about the layers there. So in the garden, for January, we concentrate on one main bulb, which really does here, particularly if it's a mild winter, flower from January and February and March, which is Narcissus avalanche. And the amazing thing is, genuinely, those were put into the garden 22, 23 years ago when I did my first Narcissus trial. Multi-headed, highly scented, good vase life. And they are now planted super, super deep because I've mulched on top of them so many years running. So Narcissus avalanche kicks us off. And that gives us some picking for January. But so does a new one that we've added, which is Narcissus Cragford. And I'm always so excited when I hear of or find or see a Narcissus flowering in January or February, because to have really early flowering is just so useful for bringing spring closer. So first of all, avalanche, then Cragford. Early cheer, I always thought wasn't hardy, like paper whites, but actually we've had it growing very successfully in the garden over last winter. And early cheer, which is Erlicher. I always get it wrong and put an A-E-A-R, and it hasn't got an A, so I can't find it in the catalogues. Anyway, early cheer is another one, and that takes us through to the middle of February. So we've got avalanche, Cragford, early cheer. And then we move on for March to more standard Narcissus. And my favourite really is Actaea. All these are highly scented. And I also, as well as Actaea, I really love moving on to Recurvus, which flowers from April into May. And then in May, there can be a bit of a dip, but you can find a few late flowering Narcissus. We trialled a couple this year, and one we really fell in love with called Sinopel, Sinopel, and that flowered into May, which was wonderful. But then what we have done, cunningly, I would say, is to add the iris, Hollandicas, the Dutch iris. And we've got one called Red Embers, which is just so, so beautiful, that flowers from May into June. And it just looks so beautiful as the Narcissus are going over, out come the iris. They don't last brilliantly in a vase, but they're so rich and so velvety. And I mean, I just think totally wonderful. Love picking them. And then we move on to the alliums. And we've got a few which we've had real success with for earlies. Purple Rain, Purple Sensation, they're all really, really early. And then the good old Christophii for June. And that then crosses over with the early dahlias. And you can have dahlias, single dahlias that flower from late June. And Strawberry and Cream is a very early dahlia that flowers from the middle of June. And that will then take us through almost to when avalanche comes out into flower. So Narcissus, iris, you could add hyacinths in there too, but then the iris, alliums, dahlias gives us really pretty much year-round show and year-round picking. So I have talked about that before, but I've never talked about this other thing that we've been experimenting with now for 2 or 3 years in the greenhouse. So we're really lucky here that we have earth beds in our greenhouse. And I do really very strongly recommend that if you possibly can have an earth bed. One, it's a bigger reservoir for food and water. So if you're going to grow tomatoes in your greenhouse, don't grow them in grow bags. Don't even grow them in pots unless they're whopper pots, because they just take so much more looking after. So if you possibly can, create an earth bed or get one of those water troughs from an agricultural supply shop. They're not expensive. And fill that with compost. And that gives you almost like an earth bed that could go against one wall. So that will house your tomatoes from May until, let's say, October. But then in goes your bulb lasagne. And the point of this is that by having things inside, you often can cheat 4 to 6 weeks earlier in the flowering season of a plant than it would be in the garden. And you can grow things that aren't necessarily 100% hardy, like, for instance, Narcissus paper whites, which are from Palestine and from, I think Israel, Palestine, Syria, I think Jordan, I think they grow in the highlands there. But they're not completely hardy in this country, but they flower, as I'm sure you know, which is why they're often forced. If you force them under cover, they can flower from December onwards. So we have Narcissus paper white in a lasagne, along with Narcissus Cragford, early cheer, avalanche, all these. So outside, they're going to flower a bit later, but inside, they're going to flower from before Christmas. So I've got stuff to pick. Then I move on to anemone coronarias, and they're guaranteed to be in flower by Valentine's Day. And so we have lots of new varieties from the Mistral series that I think are bred in Italy. We had lots on trial this year, and they were just incredible. Huge, great sources in the Mistral series. And I love picking those and had them all over the house from the middle of February onwards. So they flower in February. Then by the beginning of March, in your lasagne, in the bottom layer, because they're the biggest bulb, are your tulips. And the two that we had huge success with were Orca and Exotic Emperor. And they were both in flower by the first week of March. So those come next, and they both pick absolutely brilliantly. And then come the ranunculus. And they gave me so much pleasure this year. I picked and picked and picked. They last 2 weeks in a vase. You'll know them, the button ranunculus, because they're so fashionable in the spring. They fill every groovy florist shop. And I love the butterfly ranunculus even more, that are the single varieties, and they flower a little bit later. And they have a vase life of 2.5 or even 3 weeks. And there are beautiful varieties like Ariadne. But the problem with ranunculus in a dry environment, which is in a greenhouse, is that they can get mildew. And so what we do is we start to treat both the anemones, but particularly the ranunculus, with a weekly spray of baking powder mixed with a tiny drop of sunflower oil and a tiny drop of liquid Ecova or liquid soap in water into a water atomizer, and just a teaspoon of baking powder. And we then douse the leaves of all those bulbs that tend to mildew, particularly the ranunculus, every week as soon as they begin to emerge, which normally with the anemones will be January, with the ranunculus will be about a month or 6 weeks later. And that way you have pristine foliage, which makes for much more production and much better and healthier and longer vase life flowers. So in the greenhouse, in our lasagne, we have the narcissus and the tulips in the bottom layer. Next layer up are the anemones. Next layer up are the ranunculus. And next layer, almost like a pot topper on the top, are wallflowers. And that way, from December with the early narcissus, January early narcissus, anemones for February, ranunculus for February into March, butterfly ranunculus March into April. By then, the garden is absolutely chock-a-block. Oh, and I forgot the tulips are in there in early March. By then, the garden is chock-a-block full of tulips. So you've used your greenhouse to the nth degree. And don't forget, also use your greenhouse for equivalent edibles. So you want some lettuce, like the Merveille de Quatre Saisons, the Marvel of Four Seasons, and black-seeded Simpson, which are really hardy and fantastic for winter production. You want some salad leaves like Mitsuna and Salad Rocket and red frills mustard. Completely happy growing in a greenhouse will produce all winter long. You want some hardy herbs, flat-leaf parsley, chervil, coriander, and maybe some other nice leafy greens, chard and spinach. And so that way you're not just using your greenhouse for your tomatoes, perhaps the odd chili and an aubergine between May and the end of September. You're using it genuinely year-round, exactly the same space, not to store your barbecue, your outside furniture and your parasol, but to grow food and flowers to enhance your life right the way through the winter. And with that bulb lasagne, you really don't need a big greenhouse, because you could even do it in a pot. So I hope that will prompt you to think about now being the time to start sowing all those salad leaves and those herbs, and to be planting a bulb lasagne, both outside and inside. The dahlias can go over the top outside next spring, but now is the time to get all those narcissus in the ground to give you wonderful flowers out in the garden, but before that, inside in your greenhouse, if you have one. And if you don't, you could even do it under a plastic cloche. You know, you don't need to have total protection. You can go out with some fleece if we are predicted to go to a -5 or something. I just think we don't use our space, our gardens, enough in the winter months to produce beautiful food and flowers to enhance our lives inside. So I hope you will, because I'm going to. Thanks so much for listening to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange with me, Sarah Raven. Next week, I'm going to talk about the tricky month that is February and how by planting now you can bring spring closer. And that for me is a number one priority, that the garden can really enhance my life inside as well as outside, but inside. And I'm going to give you my top selections for February flowers. So see you then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.